couple of people to come back, but actually a crowd of people came back. So if you'd like to come back, and it's literally to talk back. Luke will be able to stay for a little while for that, but then he's got a train to catch back to London, so we can just use that time to talk about anything that you'd like to talk about Dorset Humanists, or anything that's on your mind, as long as it's not Brexit. Yeah, that's about that, but then we have to finish at 4:30 to leave the hall. Well, our speaker today is Luke Donnellan. Luke is Head of Education at Humanists UK, which means that he's responsible for promoting the understanding of humanism, especially in formal education settings. He manages Humanists UK's School Speakers Programme, the teacher training, so for RE teachers who want to know how to teach about humanism, Luke organises that service for them, and CPD, continuing professional development for people who want to go into schools. He also manages the production of educational resources, and you may have seen there's a very good Understanding Humanism website online. Before joining Humanists UK, Luke was a primary school teacher and a maths leader. He's also worked as a freelance philosophy teacher in both primary and secondary schools. I know he's a very good speaker because I've heard him before, so I know we're in for a very informative and enjoyable afternoon. So please give Luke a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, David. David's given a brief introduction to who I am, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to start by saying a little bit about what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to first of all talk to you a little bit about the education picture relating to religion and belief in the UK at the moment. The main way that the subject of questions and ideas related to religion and belief is taught comes through religious education, so I'm going to focus a little bit on what the current state of religious education is, and then what position humanism currently plays in religious education, and obviously what our goals are to see that humanism have a more prominent role within the subject. I'm also going to talk a little bit to you about Humanists UK and what it is that we're doing. Primarily our Understanding Humanism work to support young people's understanding of humanism, and hopefully at the end I'll be able to sort of let you know a little bit about some of the success that we're having, and also some of the goals that we still have and how you can all help with those. So first of all, actually I've got to click that out now. So first of all, I'm going to I've just spotted this as well before I start. I've left all the subheading to go in here, so come up with your own subheading. I'm going to think about it. Be appropriate there. I'm going to start off with the RE landscape. So what is the current situation? RE is religious education. And basically, RE is a mess. I apologise if there are any RE teachers in the room. I'm not saying your RE is a mess or RE is a mess in your particular school. But as a subject, there are some fundamental problems with religious education at the moment. And this isn't just humanists who are claiming this. It's people across the religion and belief spectrum. It's people working in all areas of education. So I'm hopefully going to explain a little bit about some of the problems with RE before we move on to look at some of the solutions to those. So first of all, the big question is really about who decides what students learn in RE. Now, RE as a subject is different from many other subjects on the curriculum, because there's no national curriculum for the subject. It's not like maths or English or geography or history, where there's a national curriculum, an entitlement that all students have in terms of what it is that they're to learn during their schooling. In RE, the decisions are made by a number of different groups. And ultimately this can lead to a very confusing situation in which two students living next door to each other could have very different religious education if they go to very different schools at opposite ends of the road. So first of all, there's what are called SACREs. And SACRE stands for Standing Advisory Council for RE. There won't be a test on all these acronyms I've used today, you'll hopefully be pleased to hear. But basically, they're the people who each local authority has a group called a SACRE, and they set a locally agreed syllabus for that local authority on what the content should be in religious education. There are 173 of these around the country. Some of them work in partnerships, some of them work in larger groups, but ultimately it means that there are a huge number of different syllabuses that say what young people should be learning in religious education. And this is partly a legacy from 1944, from the Education Act back in 1944, in which it was felt, and fairly sensibly so, that young people should learn about the religions and beliefs in the community around them. They should have the chance, so that kind of more local perspective. If you lived in an area where there was a high number of Catholics or a high number of Jews, it was sensible to get to know about what the people around you believed in. Of course, we now live in a much more global world, and we're much more mobile, we move around, so even if you felt that was a justification back then, that no longer holds. It's now the situation that young people will encounter people they're mobile, they'll encounter people from their local community, but also the rest of the UK, from around the world. And so RE as a subject, that local dimension, although it's still important, there's no longer really a strong case to say it should be locally, or RE should be locally defined. There are problems when children change schools. For example, if you went to a primary school in one area and then you go to a secondary school in a different local authority, you can end up covering the same stuff twice. You can end up having gaps in your education because one school, one local authority will teach something at one age range and a different one at a different age range. So there's problems with the nature of this system. Another problem is that the syllabus is who's the representatives on the SACREs. Are there any humanist SACRE reps in the room? Okay, we've got a few in here. Excellent. So they're basically made up of representatives from education, of teachers, but also representatives of all the different faith and belief groups. And these people who are the representatives of faith and belief groups can very often largely dictate what the content of the syllabus is. So you can imagine they can often give a very biased impression of what it is that Buddhists believe, or Hindus believe, or Muslims believe. And also they're not education experts. I've been in at least 2 situations, I'm on the SACRE in Lewisham, in which I've heard a Buddhist rep on one occasion and somebody else on another occasion hand over the syllabus, that their units, they're part of the syllabus, and say, here's what you young people will be learning about, for example, Buddhism, and say, I wish somebody who knew more about Buddhism was able to write this. And you've got a classic case there of these people who are writing syllabuses, but are not education experts, and not necessarily even experts on the religion or belief that they are writing the units for. So there's a huge number of problems with this system. And to complicate things further, many schools don't have to follow their locally agreed syllabus. Academies and free schools, of which there are an increasing number, that don't have to follow the locally agreed syllabus, they can set their own. Independent schools will have different syllabuses as well. And actually what really drives what's included in RE is the exams. The exams at the end of Key Stage 4, what the content is of those exams, the GCSEs, really drives what the content is of religious education throughout young people's schooling. So because now an awful lot of people at GCSE are covering just Christianity and Islam as part of the GCSE, that means schools, and you can understand why they're doing it, are saying those are the religions we need to be focusing on all the way through, because otherwise we're not going to get the grades, we're not going to appear at the right place in the league tables, and there are consequences of that. So the GCSEs and the exams drive a lot of what's going on in religious education, and there have been big changes to those GCSEs fairly recently. The subject RE, the GCSE on RE until a couple of years ago, used to be quite philosophical. There was quite a lot of philosophy in there, there's quite a lot of ethics in there, and it was quite a popular subject because of this. The new GCSE is much more focused on religion, it's much more theological, and some of the motivations behind this was for it to be much more knowledge-based. People wanted the subject to be much more based on actual knowledge that whether there were right and wrong answers, largely because it's easier to mark. But unfortunately, and there's good reasons for kind of having a knowledge-based curriculum, but it has raised challenges. It has meant that now there's opportunities for young people to encounter a lot of the philosophical arguments, a lot of the philosophical questions around religion and belief. And now doing a lot more textual study of the Bible and a lot more study of specific religions. And here's an example of some of the comments that are coming up from teachers about the new GCSE. And this isn't, I'm not saying that all teachers, there are plenty of teachers who like the new GCSE, but also many of them, as this comment illustrates, are finding the level of challenge is particularly difficult. But also, a lot of young people who don't come from a religious background are asking questions of, what's in this for us? Why are we learning about religion to this extreme level of depth? And I think that's what that's creating, as I'll show you in a moment, it's putting a lot more people off the subject. So it might be surprising to some, but RE was a particularly popular subject until a few years ago. Some of these changes are meaning that now that popularity is waning. So in the GCSE last year, there was a 13% drop in the number of students taking religious education at GCSE. And that's potentially because the subject's got harder, but also it becomes less appealing to an awful lot of students as well. We've also seen...
Who is supposed to read that?
You could, if you wish to read it, you may read it.
It's very illiterate.
Well, it's Facebook. I don't, this is,
I don't know what disinterested means.
Basically, to sum up, the point I'm making is that the RE GCSE has become much more heavily focused on studying religion in depth. And this is putting students off, teachers often finding it harder to teach, and it's having an impact on the number of students who are taking the subject. For another thing that's relevant, another case for that was another further evidence of that, is the National Association of Teachers of RE, who are called NATRE, did a survey into who's teaching RE and where it's being taught around the country, and discovered that 28% of schools are not teaching RE as a weekly lesson, and that number goes up to 44% in academies and free schools. Many schools, including academies, up to 60%. So only 60% of academies have a specialist RE teacher, so an RE teacher who's qualified in that particular subject. And this is obviously meaning, to sort of bring this to a sort of summary, is that the subject is in trouble. And there may be people there saying, thinking, okay, great, RE is going, it's dying, there's a lot of problems with RE, that's a good thing. But at Humanists UK, we support RE. We support RE because we believe young people should have the opportunity to learn about religions and beliefs and non-religious beliefs, and have the opportunity to explore those big questions. And RE is very often the only space in the curriculum to be able to do that. And also, if we want young people to become aware of humanism, to learn about humanism, to understand what humanism means, RE is the place for that very often to appear in the curriculum. So there's a problem here. Although RE can be taught very well in some schools it's taught very badly. So we may feel the conclusion is, well, if RE is dying, that's not a bad thing. But actually, what we want to see is we want to see better RE. We want to see good RE, that's an inclusive and relevant RE, in which humanism plays a part, and we want to see all schools delivering that RE. So what happened last year was, 2 years ago actually, a commission was set up by the Religious Education Council, a commission on RE, and their role was to review the whole status of RE. What were the aims and purposes of RE? What ultimately were the problems with RE at the moment, and what were some potential solutions to improving the subject? And they came up with a number of recommendations. And the first of those was to change the name of the subject. So from religious education, they said it should be called Religion and Worldviews. And there's still the question of whether it needs to have the word religion in the title, but I think they felt if they tried to remove the word religion completely, people would, there would be too much opposition to that. But they did decide to use the word religion in the singular, so they're not saying religions and worldviews, because obviously religions are worldviews. There are religious worldviews and there are non-religious worldviews. But they felt in the singular in the sense of studying what is religion, what is this thing called religion. And worldviews would be inclusive. It would include religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews. They also said that there should be a national entitlement, that all students should be able to learn. So this would mean that every school, regardless of what local authority it was in, regardless of whether it was an academy or a faith school, every student should have a national entitlement to learn certain things about religious education, certain things about religion and non-religious worldviews. And that was a much more sociological approach to RE. It looked a lot more about what it meant to hold a worldview, what it was like to live with the different kinds of worldviews. It looked at how worldviews changed, how they interacted, the diversity within worldviews, the impact worldviews have on power structures in countries, the impact worldviews have on individual lives, the way that they interact with each other. So a much, as far as Humanists UK could see, a much improved version of religious education. It focused on the understanding that there are institutional worldviews, but there are also personal worldviews. People's worldviews sometimes can match with an institutional worldview, but sometimes will involve aspects of different worldviews. So all this hopefully would enable young people to recognise that it wasn't simply the case that all Christians believed this, and all Muslims believed this, and even all humanists believed this, but belief and behaviour and a sense of identity are complicated pictures. It's a messy picture that you've got out there. And so this was a significantly improved vision for RE. They also said that schools should be held to account in the sense that RE should be inspected. Also, religion and worldview should be inspected. Which means that if schools that weren't teaching it would get in trouble, which at the moment isn't really the case. Ofsted, who are the inspectors of schools, don't really pay much attention to RE. They felt there should be increased funding for training for teachers, and they also said that there should be the right of SACREs to set locally agreed syllabuses should be removed. There should be national programmes of study. And I think the conclusion was there'd be a national entitlement, fairly small, and then there will be some variety in those programmes of study, so there'll still be the opportunity for schools to teach slightly different things, but that national entitlement was core. That meant that everybody got to encounter the range of different religious and non-religious worldviews. So, Humanists UK, this is a lot of the things that came out of this report were what we've been arguing for 50 years, and yes, there's a lot that was positive in there. So what was the response? Well, one thing, the majority of people, the majority of people in the RE world said, excellent, great, we've got to go with this. And the main reason they did that is, I think, well, largely lots of them agree, but even those that weren't overly happy feel if the subject doesn't change, it's going to die. Two main groups came out against the report, the Catholic Education Service and the Board of Deputies of British Jews were the two groups that said, no, we don't like this. And also the organisation NASACA, which is the national body that represents all those local SACREs. And I think partly because they felt power was being taken away from the SACREs that they also have expressed serious concerns. Humanists UK will come out in support of it. There are issues within there. I think everybody has issues. It's not perfect. There are complications relating to the definitions of worldviews. They include things like atheism and secularism as worldviews, and as I'll come on to a little bit later, these positions are not worldviews. But overall, it's an incredibly positive thing. However, just before Christmas, the Department for Education wrote their response to this and basically said, thanks, but no thanks. Whether this is because Damien Hines, the Department for Education, is a Catholic, who knows, but their response has obviously been, the rest of the RE community has reacted very strongly and said this isn't acceptable. I think what will happen next obviously remains to be seen. But what we've come from is a position where I think I used to say, whenever I was talking, until before the Commission, I used to say everyone agrees that the subject needs to change, but everybody disagrees how. And I think now we're getting to a point where there is much more consensus about how the subject needs to change. The middle ground amongst the RE community has moved much closer to the humanist position. There are obviously those people who still are fighting against this, but that is a positive in itself, that the consensus has shifted. Whether anything happens from this obviously remains to be seen, but it does now mean that the humanist voice then about what should happen to RE carries a lot more weight because it's supported by a lot of other people. The RE Council of England and Wales support the Commission, and they represent groups from across faith and belief communities and also across different education bodies, and so we should take that as a positive. The question is whether anything will change in the Department for Education. So I've given you some of a kind of overview of where RE is at the moment. In summary, the subject currently is in a bit of a mess. However, the Commission on RE can be seen as a positive attempt to solve some of those problems, but we're still in a position in which that requires change at a government policy level, and we're awaiting anything to happen. So the next thing I'm going to move on to, again include your own subheading please, is why should we be including humanism in education? I'm guessing as you come to a Dorset Humanists talk, many of you are in favour of humanism being included, but that might not be the case for everybody. First of all, it's the law. In 2015, Humanists UK supported various parents who took the Department for Education to court about the new GCSE in religious education, as it didn't include the option to study humanism. And on human rights grounds, those parents, with our support, won that case. The final judgment said that non-religious beliefs the state is not entitled to discriminate between religions and beliefs on a qualitative basis. Basically, non-religious beliefs should be treated with equal respect within the curriculum to religious beliefs. Unfortunately, again, the government largely buried their head in the sand over this, and very little actual change has happened in terms of a change to kind of religious education from a government, from a legal, well, the law has changed, but from a government policy perspective, very little has changed. But it has had an impact on schools. Schools, I think, now are saying, okay, we recognise that that we do need to be more inclusive. Now, if you're trying to persuade schools to sort of invite in a humanist school speaker, or to use your resources or be more inclusive of humanism, I wouldn't always say the best thing to do is to threaten the law. It doesn't necessarily go down particularly well with teachers. So we tried to present some various other arguments before that. One of those is obviously the number of non-religious people in the United Kingdom. We're now at a stage where, I think this graph actually was 2015, and that the data has changed slightly again, but basically, I think the latest figures show that about 53% of people in the United Kingdom now describe themselves as non-religious. And that figure goes up to about 71% of young people under the age of 24, which means that the vast majority of people in schools are not religious. Recently, Lois Lee, who is works at the University of Kent in Canterbury, who's heading up a big research programme at the moment called Understanding Unbelief. She says that humanism is one of what humanism itself, not just being non-religious, but the humanist worldview, is one of the two, possibly the most dominant worldview in the UK today. I don't know which of the others is the other of the two, but you can probably guess. And so we're in a position where young people in our schools, for the subject to remain relevant, we need to make sure we're including non-religious perspectives in religious education. They're also the case that, obviously, for social cohesion, for mutual understanding, if it's important to learn about if it's important for non-religious people to learn what religious people believe, the opposite is also true. It's important for young people from religious backgrounds to be aware of what it means to be non-religious. It's important for young people to see that questions about beliefs, identity, meaning, purpose, ethics are relevant to them. And if non-religious perspectives are excluded from RE, then they face the question of, well, is any of this for me? Are any of these big, exciting, wonderful philosophical questions for me at all? If all they hear is, here's a big question, here's the Christian response, here's the Muslim response, here's the Sikh response, but no humanist response or no non-religious response at all, then the assumption is that these questions aren't for them. So ultimately, RE is a poorer subject for not being inclusive of humanism and the non-religious perspectives. So what are we doing? So at the moment, I've sort of summed up, I guess, what Humanists UK's goals are for education at the moment. So one of these is specifically focused on humanism. We think every young person should have the opportunity to learn about humanism and leave school with an accurate and sound understanding of humanist beliefs and values. And this is very much a goal that fits within that sort of RE framework about the content and knowledge that young people should leave school with. But secondly, we think that every young person should have the opportunity to explore life's fundamental questions and be equipped with the knowledge and skills to decide for themselves how to lead happy, ethical and meaningful lives. So this one is more, I guess, about the focus, about how this content should be taught. We think that some of those key skills, such as critical thinking, such as reasoning skills, are essential if you're going to be exploring these questions. We think giving people the confidence to feel that they have the freedom and autonomy to decide for themselves about how to answer some of these questions, but also the knowledge base behind that to make sure that they're doing that in an informed way. We think that young people should develop the questioning skills required to be able to address some of these big questions, big ideas. And we also think young people should have the capacity to become creative and develop independent thought, because very often creativity can be a source, and certainly when people are searching for questions around how we should live and what makes our lives meaningful. We think young people should be confident to be able to talk about their needs, their rights and their responsibilities. We think they should also have the capacity, the opportunity to understand the beliefs of others and to be able to explore them, to be able to communicate with people who share different beliefs, to look where there's common ground, to try and find out where there's disagreement and where that disagreement perhaps comes from. So all these are the sorts of skills that we think should be present within a good education. And ultimately, it's not about making sure young people leave school as humanists. It's about making sure young people leave school being aware of the range of different answers to these big questions that are out there, and the confidence, the skills and the knowledge to be able to have worked out for themselves how they want to live. So how are we going about this? Well, obviously, we're not having much luck with the Department for Education at the moment. And our campaigns team, our public affairs team, obviously, a lot of their role is speaking to people at the top, speaking to the decision makers, trying to create change from above. And that is an ongoing question. They don't get a lot of sleep, our public affairs team, and there's a continual ongoing challenge for them. But what we're also doing, and probably what my role is about reaching people on the ground. So rather than shaking our fists at the people at the top and saying things need to change, it's about going to teachers, going to schools, and saying, here, we can help you. And we have the resources to help you, we can support your understanding, and that, I think, is what's making a difference. So we've now at Humanists UK got this very much sort of two-pronged approach, with people talking to policy makers and decision makers and saying this is what needs to change, but also going to teachers and saying here's how we can help you. Because there are an increasing number of teachers who, regardless of what the Department for Education say, or their locally agreed syllabus set by their SACRE says, think humanism should be included. And so if we provide good resources for them, be that school speakers, or be that lesson plans, or videos, then they will go for that. Very often teachers will want, they'll want an easy life. Teaching, I'm a former teacher, I don't think I've ever worked as hard as when I was a teacher. It's a phenomenally demanding and draining job. And if you can make it easy for teachers by saying, here are the resources to support you, they will go for that. And at the moment, we're developing a reputation that teachers will come to us because we have the resources, which a lot of other sort of faith and belief groups don't have. And I think that's, I was reading an article this morning on the way here in RE Today magazine. It's not my favourite read, but where they were talking about school speakers. And somebody's done some research into getting visitors into schools in RE, and obviously talking about the value of that. And we are the organisation that's highlighted as having a very robust programme, a programme which allows people to book easily, to be able to provide feedback, and all that sort of stuff means that when people are looking for what can we do, I need an idea, here's something we can do. It's easy, it's quick, and it's effective. So I think that opportunity to support schools with resources, to support schools with training, and to support them with school speakers is kind of reaping benefits. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the success in terms of the numbers that we're having there. Although we need to be aware that we're not the only people providing resources, and there's a slight risk element attached to this, because if RE ultimately becomes a competition between different faith and belief groups all providing resources, is that what we want to see? Do we want to see it simply being the humanists and the Christians and the Muslims and the Hindus all saying, here are our resources, come to us, we know all about this, don't use anybody else's. And I think, again, there's a problem there. I'm perhaps talking myself out of a job here, but I think we need education experts to be involved in deciding what young people teach. It can't just be faith and belief groups providing those resources. I mean, I think at Humanists UK, I'm a former teacher, I understand the world of education. We have lots of other people who contribute to our resources, who are teachers and educators. But that's not necessarily going to always be the case in all organisations. So RE shouldn't be driven by resource providers, particularly because some of these resource providers are commercial resource providers as well. And I think that's starting to have an increasing impact on what's taught in schools. For example, recently, an organisation, RE Today, has released a package called Understanding Christianity. It came out shortly after Understanding Humanism. I can't claim that they copied the name. I think they've been clearly from the size of the thing, they've been in development for quite a long time. But this is a kind of huge programme of resources for schools to teach about Christianity. And apparently the whole thing weighs about 5 kilograms. It's folders of stuff. And again, this is something where on our scale we can't compete with producing that level of resources. But the issue with this is that it means that for some schools, there's their resources. And they claim this shouldn't be all of your RE, but of course for a lot of schools, if they want it, there's all their RE on a plate, open the folder, off you go. And so again, there's questions around this about who should be deciding what's taught in RE. We've already said that there's problems with the existing system, there's a danger that it ultimately becomes purely the resource providers who make those decisions as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how should humanism be presented. If we're going to be including humanism, what should be included? And a few of the challenges that exist when we try to say you need to include humanism within RE. I mean, in brief, obviously there's some animosity to including it. There's plenty of RE teachers, plenty of schools who don't want humanism included. Some of them see it as a threat, although they will rarely express that. We get kind of arguments that say, I've heard a lot of these on the SACRE that I'm on, A lot of people will say humanism is too simple, but then in the same meeting you'll have other people say it's too hard, it's too complicated, we can't get it. There's not enough humanists to warrant teaching about humanism, and then you'll get, well, humanism's everywhere, humanism is just the standard common sense. And again, both these arguments will often come up together. You get humanism doesn't have enough influence on the country, or there's already too much influence of humanism in society. RE needs to be the space for religions, not the kind of the universal secular understanding. So there's lots of animosity still exists. But there's also issues with teachers' subject knowledge. A lot of people don't understand what humanism is. A lot of teachers are not subject specialists, so they don't understand a lot about Christianity, which is what they've got to teach. So when it comes to subjects that they don't necessarily have to include, and they don't have the subject knowledge to do that. But what I've done here is, one of the things before I go through this bit is we need to also be aware that the enemy is not always religion. Sometimes sometimes people, and our school speakers can sometimes think when they're going into school that the children either will be religious or they will be brainwashed by the religious, and that humanism is there to kind of sort of defend against this. And it's not, and I think what often they will discover in a lot of schools is, for most of the students, religion is not an issue at all. It's not part of their lives, they have very little understanding of it. And I think we need to be aware that our goals when we're in schools is very often the enemy is apathy. It's a lack of interest in these questions. It's not about going in there and saying, okay, there's problems with religious approaches to life. It's going in there and saying, actually, these questions are important to you. If you're not religious, get engaged with these issues. I think most young people are going to probably leave school either as hedonists or as nihilists, and there's probably not a huge amount we can do about that with 16-year-olds. But what we're aiming to do is say, that time when maybe when you're a little bit older and you do start to get an interest in some of these questions, that you've at least heard the range of different answers. So at that point you can say, actually, I remember that humanist who came into school 10 years ago. I'm going to find out a little bit more about that now. It's not about, we talk a lot to our school speakers when they're in schools, it's not about changing minds when you're in there. It's about giving people the knowledge, the resources with which that they can make their own decisions. So I've highlighted from here kind of some of the arguments that come up, or some of the issues really, that come up when we say humanism needs to be included. First of these is what I call, we already teach about humanism, or atheism is very often said. We already do that, we don't need to do any more. And very often this is an argument where teachers will say, we cover all the arguments against the existence of God, so we've done humanism, we've done that. And it's about presenting humanism negatively. And in a lot of cases, this is about presenting humanism as something in opposition to religion, defining it as something that's arisen in opposition to religion that defines itself in conflict with religion. And obviously what we want to get across is that isn't the way to be presenting humanism. Humanism needs to be presented as something positive. It needs to we need to talk about humanism as something that stands on its own 2 feet. It doesn't define itself purely in opposition to religion. There's another case which is, we say, as teachers will say, if we're going to be inclusive, let's be really inclusive. And this says, well, if we're going to include humanism, let's include everything. Let's include all worldviews. And some of the worldviews that they'll say, well, we should be teaching about vegetarianism and feminism and communism and capitalism. And although I think these things need to be appear in people's education, they're not necessarily worldviews in the same way that humanism is, and so not necessarily part of the RE curriculum. And so very often this leads on to the next one, which is this kind of idea that people are very keen to say, okay, we'll include the non-religious, but we're going to include them as this very diverse bunch of people who haven't really made their minds up about a lot of things. The non-religious are this undefined group. And so we'll present them that way. Very differently to the way that Christianity, for example, is presented, which can very often be presented much more monolithically as, here are the Christians Christians believe this. Whereas the non-religious, well, some of them believe this, some of them believe that. They haven't made their minds up about a lot of stuff. And so obviously, one of our roles is to say, we don't say all humanists believe this, but we want to show that a lot of non-religious people do have a coherent set of beliefs. That their beliefs aren't just sort of different Monday to Thursday, but they can have a solid worldview on which they kind of base their decisions about how to live. And the last one is about misconceptions, and this is about the challenge of making people aware of what humanism is, because sometimes we can get a lot of people who say, well, if humanism is not this, then it must be that. And sometimes, so for example, if humanists don't believe in a sort of universal moral law, then they must all be relativists. They must all think anything, there are no answers to these questions, anything goes. So very often humanism can sometimes be seen as, if you don't agree with this part of a religion, then it must mean that you are this. So we can see, for example, if you don't buy into the fact that if there's, as I say, there's no universal sort of moral law. It's often the kind of classic example. Then everybody must be an individualist. You must only do what is of value to yourself. So sometimes we have issues with people sort of making that kind of misconception. There's also people who often raise the question of, well, what about religious humanism? Again, there we'll say, well, some people might define themselves that way, but the current understanding of humanism, as by Humanists UK and by most humanist organisations today, is a non-religious approach to life. There's also people who will today talk about what they call post-humanism. And post-humanism, they define it as sort of humanism plus. And the plus is humanism who also care about other living creatures and the natural world. And of course, many humanists would say, well, I don't need to define myself as a post-humanist. As a humanist, I already care about those things. And again, I think sometimes this is partly presented as a challenge to humanism. It's about trying to find things that are wrong with humanism by saying, well, now people have moved on to post-humanism now, so humanists still have these flaws, rather than saying, well, actually, you can be a humanist and actually care about the environment and other non-human animals as well. One of the I'm just going to show you now a few slides, which I'm going to skip over the next one, but then I'm going to move on to one of the big misconceptions which has arisen recently, which has come from a chap called Yuval Noah Harari. Some of you may be familiar with him. He wrote two very popular books over the last few years, one called Sapiens and one called Homo Deus. And he uses a definition of humanism which is very different to the definition, I guess, that most humanists would use. So I'm going to show you a few slides here. This is Harari. So here's a few of the things that he says in the book Sapiens about humanism. And again, if you are humanists, then see if these resonate with you. So he says humanism involves the belief that Homo sapiens has a unique and sacred nature that is fundamentally different from the nature of all other beings and phenomena. Again, using this word sacred. He says that humanism is a family of religions that worship humanity, or more correctly, Homo sapiens. So he describes humanism as a religion. He believes that humanists seek to perfect humanity, or see the perfection of humanity as the supreme good. He says that humanists claim the rest of the world and all other beings exist solely for the benefit of our species. He argues that the environment should be controlled and manipulated for human needs. And he also says that humanism is founded on monotheistic beliefs. So, if there are some humanists in this room, I'm guessing there probably are, I would imagine that you would look at these and think, that doesn't necessarily resonate with my understanding of humanism. Harari also says that the crimes of Nazism, Stalinism and environmental destruction can all find their origins in the tenets of humanism. It's responsible for an age of intense religious fervour, unparalleled missionary efforts and the bloodiest wars of religion in history. Again, so humanism is pretty much at fault for everything that's gone wrong since the Enlightenment. Some of the things that he includes within his definition of humanism, he includes communism, capitalism, nationalism, Nazism, utopianism, all these different ideologies that, again, most humanists would say that humanism, well, some of these certainly, are very opposite of what humanism stands for, and others aren't really connected with humanism at all. And there's a problem here, I hope you can see, because we've already had school speakers in schools, at least on one occasion, where the teacher has introduced the school speaker by saying Hitler was a humanist, which the school speaker had to suddenly sort of backpedal and rethink what they were going to say in their talk. And obviously, these books are reaching millions of people. And so there are, and what's interesting actually, Harari is, if you read him, a lot of what he says, he's quite humanist in terms of our sort of sense of humanism. He sounds quite humanist in his outlook on life. He's not religious. I might say there's plenty of things I would disagree with Harari on, but actually I think he sees a lot of positives in the sort of humanism as we understand it. The problem is in his definitions. And this is another challenge that we face, because obviously, teachers, if they're going to be saying, okay, we've got to teach about humanism, where can I find out about humanism? Oh, this best-selling book might give me some clues. So these are all things that we need to be aware of. So again, another big challenge there in summary, that even if we are getting humanism included, there's still a lot of work to be done in educating teachers and subsequently obviously students in what humanism is. I'm not saying that there is a single monolithic humanism that must be taught, but also I think if we're teaching a kind of humanism that the vast majority of people who define themselves as humanists disagree with, something's also gone wrong there. So last little bit, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about kind of what we're doing in terms of resources. So we've recently, now 2016, we launched, developed a website called Understanding Humanism, and this has a huge range of teaching resources on there. There are lesson plans, videos, classroom activities. It's where schools can download planning guidelines to help them plan a scheme of work on humanism. They can book teacher training, they can book a school speaker to come in to visit their schools, talk about humanism. And all these things have, I'll show you in a moment some of the stats that have proved incredibly popular. Our goal, therefore, is really to sort of reach teachers on the ground and say, okay, regardless of what you're being told from above, we can support you to teach about humanism. And it's proved very, very successful. I'm going to give you a couple of examples now before I wrap up of some of the resources that are on there. So one of them comes from a lesson which is about freedom, responsibility and connections. But we also call it humanism on a piece of string. And so on the board you can see our new Humanists UK logo. And the idea behind this came from this idea that this logo is built up from some very sort of limited materials, but also feels like it's quite dynamic, it has a lot of freedom, it can be reshaped into many different things. So what the lesson plan involves is really getting students to say, okay, can you create a happy human with a piece of string? And off they go, they do that, and they're well done, the first part of the lesson, they've got their happy human there. And then we'll say to them, okay, think about that piece of string. In many ways, it's very like a humanist understanding of a human being. It's material. It's not got any sort of supernatural element to it. It's got a start and an end, like a human life, and there's nothing after that. It's limited, it has certain limits, and that's what human beings have. We have certain limits in terms of our capacities as well. But it's also something that's flexible, it's fluid, and it can be reshaped in the way that our own lives can. We have a sense of autonomy, a sense of control over our lives. We're the authors of our own story. And so we then get students to explore what could they create, what's important to them. And you'll see images here about things like family, the world, interests, passions that they have. And there are different ways that we can make our lives meaningful, and the control we have over that ourselves. The fact that we have a certain sense of say. And also that we're capable of change. That maybe we can change our beliefs, we can change our approaches to life. We're not fixed creatures. We can, as we go through life, we can change. So the things that are important to us, the things that give our life meaning as we go through, can change as we go on. What we then go on to do is we ask them to say, okay, now tie your string to somebody else's and try again. or tie it to somebody else's wrist and try and create it again. And they'll notice how there are limits then to what they can do. In a sense, there's a battle with one person trying to build something here and one person trying to build something here. And again, that represents this very human fact that we don't live life alone. We're not solitary creatures. And so we have to adapt. Our own freedom has to take into account the fact that other people should be free as well. Our freedom should not limit other people's freedom. And they'll recognise that there are limits there on our freedom, and that creates a certain sense of responsibility that we have to make sure that we're trying to enhance freedom for everybody. And finally then they'll go on to say, okay, now as a group, combine your strings and create an image together. And what hopefully they will then do is produce something bigger and better. The sort of sum is greater than the parts. And they'll see that kind of a humanist idea about the value of connections that we have in our life. That actually connections with other people can enrich our lives and actually enhance our freedom. So this sense that perhaps other people are limiting on us can be true to a certain extent, but because different people have different talents, different passions, different interests, that humanity as a whole can produce so much more than the individual can. So we're focusing here on a lesson that's quite practical and quite creative for the students as well, but really gives the opportunity to get across some of those core beliefs, understanding about humanism, about the value humanists place on freedom, on individual autonomy, about the recognition humanists have that we are social creatures and that brings certain responsibilities with it, and also the importance humanists place on connections. As the enforcer says, only connect. This idea that through connecting with other people, that can be a source of meaning in our life. It can give us something greater than ourselves, and that we don't need a religious sense of meaning in order to live happy and fulfilling lives. So that's kind of one of the sort of examples of the resources we use. A second one here, if you ignore the sort of top quote, I'll read the one at the bottom to you. This might be quite small for those of you at the back. This is a quote from Bertrand Russell. And he says, an individual human existence should be like a river, small at first, narrowly contained within its banks, and rushing passionately past boulders and over waterfalls. Gradually the river grows wider, the banks recede, the waters flow more quietly, and in the end, without any visible break, they become merged in the sea, and painlessly lose their individual being. The man or woman who in old age can see his or her life in this way will not suffer from the fear of death, since the things that they care for will continue. So what we get students to do here is to think about humanist understanding of death. An idea that can sometimes be scary to some people, the idea that there is no afterlife. And this idea that for humanists there is a sense in which something of us can survive our deaths. We can live on through our genes, the genes that we pass on to our children. But also we can live on through the ideas that we've shared with other people, the memories we leave behind in other people, the contributions, the lasting contributions that we've made to the world around us, the changes we might have brought about in society. All those are the kind of the only afterlife we can have, but they still mean that it can help us to think about the way we want to live. So we ask students to imagine a river, imagine their life as a river, and draw it out. Think of the twists and turns, the changes in their life. Think about the waterfalls they've rushed over with excitement. Think about the boulders, the blockages, the dams that have got in their way. But then to think about how their lives have crossed with other rivers, their families, their friends, the people around them, their community, and the ideas that they've got from other people, and how their lives are not these single rivers, but they're connected with others. And then finally to think about as their rivers joins the river delta where all the rivers cross together and they flow out, what do they want to leave behind in the sea of humanity? What from their life do they want to leave behind? What sense, what's important to them? What things can they leave after they're gone? And I think this, again, in a quite practical way, gives young people the opportunity to really think about about humanism, about some of those big ideas, about humanist understanding of death, but in a positive way. It's also quite a good resource because you can think about life like this if you're religious as well. You may think I go on to something else as well after this sea of humanity in which I wash out into, but it doesn't stop you thinking about the things that you leave behind here. And so again, it's a very open and accessible resource to students. And again, we've got a whole range of different resources exploring all sorts of things connected with humanist beliefs, how we can understand the world, how we should live our lives, ethical dilemmas, but we try and make things practical, but also accessible, but the core thing being getting across some of that core knowledge about what it means to live as a humanist. So the last thing I'm just going to say is very briefly some of the success we've been having. So our school speakers, last year we spoke to over 30,000 students in over 300 schools, and that's up from 6,000 students in 80 schools in 2015. So if you look in the last sort of 3 years, kind of 5 times greater number of students we're speaking to. And again, in 2018, over 30,000 people visited the Understanding Humanism website and downloaded over 20,000 resources. And that's up from 5,000 people visiting that was our former education website in 2015. So we've seen a big change. We've seen a lot more people coming to use our resources, but there's still an awful lot of work to do. We've still got an awful lot of ground to make up on a lot of other organisations who've been in the RE world for a long time. We've still got an awful lot of schools to reach. An awful lot of schools, awful lot of parts of the country that are not inviting in school speakers, that are not downloading our resources, that are therefore probably not teaching anything about humanism. And that's where we need the support that anybody helps provide to Humanists UK, helps support getting into those more harder to reach areas. So just thinking about some of the things that you might be able to do to help, if you're interested in supporting our work and helping more young people to become aware of what humanism is and understand, develop an accurate and sound understanding of humanism. And I've brought with me some various flyers that can be handed out to teachers and schools and other educators to sort of draw their attention to our work and our resources and our school speakers. You can follow us on Twitter. And if you're on Twitter, then do retweet what we do. Again, it helps to raise understanding of humanism. If you're on a SACRE, do talk to teachers. If there are opportunities, if you know teachers, do talk to them. Look out for local RE teachers conferences. I can share these slides with you afterwards, and again, so any of the websites on here, people can access if they want. But there's going to talk to local RE teachers at RE teachers conferences, even if it's just handing out some flyers or saying, look, if you're interested in a school speaker, we know where you can go and get one. If you're a parent or you know parents, get them to write into their schools. And again, on our website, we have information that a template letter, email that parents can send into their schools to sort of persuade, hopefully, the teachers and the head teachers to invite people in. And again, look for opportunities to sort of contact schools, things like World Humanist Day, Darwin Day, Interfaith Week. Oh, it's Interfaith Week. I'm assuming you're inviting in a humanist as well as your the religious representatives to talk to the students in this week as well. So look for opportunities throughout the calendar year for chances to get into schools or make people aware of what resources are available on those particular dates. But the key thing is emphasising the positive. This is what I'd like to end on. I say emphasise the positive. If you're trying to persuade teachers and schools to include humanism, talking about what's wrong with RE, talking about what's wrong with religion, is not going to open any doors. You've got to talk about it from a perspective of what's positive about humanism and what's positive about being inclusive, about giving young people the opportunity to talk about the wide range of different worldviews out there, about giving young people the opportunities to make their decisions for themselves, about the fact that huge numbers of the population are not religious these days, and these questions are still of relevance to them. Okay, so it's really about, I think, with teachers and schools waving fists and saying you're doing everything wrong, it's never going to change anything, and it's not going to open doors. It's about saying, look, here's how we can enhance the education that you offer. Here's how we can make religious education better. Here's how we can do more, ultimately, to help make young people live happier, richer, more meaningful lives. So do please do all you can to help what we can. If anybody's interested in training to become a school speaker, again, grab me afterwards, or let David know. He's got all our details as well. I hope I've given you some enthusiasm about the state that the developments that have been made in RA, but also hopefully a little bit of momentum to sort of see that there's still a lot of work to be done, and so keep pushing. We'll get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. I just want to add that Dorset Humanists has got a team of school speakers, so we do support you if you are interested in visiting schools. So if anyone is inspired today to become a school speaker, then we have got a local team that will support you doing that. Has somebody got a roving mic? Yeah, so Dean has got one. Who wants to run around with it? Phil, okay. So the usual rules apply. I'm just going to give you a quick training course on how to use the microphone. When it's in front of you, there's a little green thing there, just hold it nice and steady in front of your mouth like that, and then we'll be able to hear you. Okay. Just so Phil is demonstrating that. So he's doing it perfectly. So, okay, so do we have any questions for... Right, we've got quite a few. So, yep, Sally first, and then Toby and Kathy.
I hope I'm getting this right, is that right?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you very much, very interesting talk. One thing that came up on one of the slides that you didn't actually touch on was the right of withdrawal. Did I understand correctly? Did the Commission think the right of withdrawal should stay, or what was the situation?
Yeah, you're right, I did miss that bit. So their conclusions was that the right of withdrawal will have to stay. I think they and many people in RE think that the right of withdrawal ultimately shouldn't exist, but in order for that to happen, RE has to be objective, critical, pluralistic. And the difficulty is, and they sought legal advice on this, that even if there's a national entitlement for RE that states that's got to be the case, on human rights grounds, on human rights law grounds, schools would still be open to challenge. And even if the school was open to one challenge and they won that challenge, that wouldn't stop anybody else challenging a different school. Their conclusion was we would like to see the right of withdrawal gone, but given the nature of the subject, it wouldn't be legally feasible to do that.
Dean, did you want to pick up?
It's only to start.
Okay, take the mic, Dean.
Yeah, it's only a simple question. I think I understood it here, but I didn't know what the right of withdrawal was.
Sorry. Yes, the right of withdrawal is parents have the right to remove their students from RE, and this has existed, I think since the 1944 Act. Basically, if a parent wants to withdraw their child from RE, they can, and it doesn't happen often. I think it's pretty rare. It tends to happen in cases where sometimes it can be people removing students from visits to mosques or doing lessons on Islam. It tends to be a fairly common reason to remove from RE. Sometimes it can just be because the parents don't approve of the RE being taught in the schools more generally. It's not a particularly common problem, and very often schools can deal with it. And as I say, in a lot of schools, RE is I think it's very easy sometimes to think of RE as being like it was when we were at school, and it is a very different subject now. Even though I say there are a lot of problems with it, in a lot of schools, RE is much more critical. It's much more inclusive. It's much more objective. There's an awful lot of RE going on out there. And so in those schools there isn't really the case to withdraw your students from it. But in some schools it is still a problem. And so parents, it happens rarely, but they will, you can remove your children if you wish.
Can we come to Toby next, Phil, and then Kathy and then John?
You briefly brought this up in the kind of objections that some people were having to having a humanist part of the curriculum, but I did want to hear the perspective that Humanists UK in general had on this. Is there currently a particular sort of debate or controversy going around in which non-religious worldviews other than humanism should be covered, and if so, what are they?
That's good. Let me flip back to a slide I whizzed over because I was conscious of time, but I'll flip back. So in the Commission on RE, these are the worldviews they picked out as worldviews which could be studied in RE. So they said humanism, atheism, agnosticism, secularism, existentialism, although obviously there can be a religious existentialist as well, or Confucianism were examples they gave. And they said communism, nationalism and capitalism were worldviews that there weren't worldviews in the sense that fitted within RE. And they said, so they felt that the criteria for a worldview, and I think we largely agree with this, is that it asks questions about the nature of reality, or answers questions about the nature of reality and how we can understand reality. And it also provides a kind of ethical framework for how we should live. Now, the problem with some of the worldviews here that they have said should be studied is, in that sense, by their own definition, they're not worldviews. Atheism and agnosticism are simply answers to a question about whether or not you believe in God. You can be a humanist atheist, you can be a nihilistic atheist, you can be a Jewish atheist. It doesn't tell you much more about somebody's worldview. In a slightly different sense, secularism is a political position. It's not a worldview. Again, you can be these are the examples of non-religious worldviews. They should be studied. But again, you can be a religious secularist. There are plenty of religious secularists we work with at Humanists UK as well. And again, existentialism and Confucianism, you might be able to say, okay, they're fine, but the numbers of people who define themselves that way in the UK is so small that I'm prepared to hear the arguments, but you could probably say a significant amount of time shouldn't necessarily be devoted to including those in RE. Which really means humanism is the only sort of obvious example. Now that doesn't mean that these things shouldn't be taught in RE. It doesn't mean that we should be talking about atheism and agnosticism and secularism. But if you're looking to teach a worldview, which is something that has both that understanding of reality and how we can understand reality, and the sort of ethical dimension about how we live our lives, humanism is perhaps the best example of that. Again, I'm prepared to hear, and I think most people are prepared to hear arguments for others, but there aren't many coming forward.
Could I possibly then make a small sort of slightly devil's advocate here, ironically enough, because I wouldn't describe myself appealing to this kind of worldview at all. But would there then be a potential case made for objectivism to be taught as a book? Because that does sort of answer sort of metaphysical questions, and it has an ethical framework. Not an ethical framework I don't think anyone here would be particularly fond of, but it does sort of fit that criteria.
In the sort of Ayn Rand
kind of way.
Well, again, there would be a case for that, and I think I'm not saying we're not saying that humanism is the only worldview, the only non-religious worldview. I think you do have to balance up a question of how prevalent that worldview is. But I think the key thing is about having a balance between teaching these worldviews that exist, but also making sure that you have the opportunity to see that they're not the only options. So perhaps you wouldn't necessarily. So I think the Commission sort of highlights some of this, that it thinks about worldviews both in terms of institutions, but also in terms of personal worldviews as well. So I think whereas you might be able to put forward the case to say we're going to let's worldviews such as humanism and then religious worldviews such as Christianity or Islam would be studied perhaps in more depth, I certainly think that young people should have the opportunity to encounter different worldviews, and also encounter worldviews that perhaps many people would say that's not you might take something like nihilism or something and say, well, should we really be teaching students about that? But I think there's a case for saying yes, they need to be aware that there's a huge range of different answers to these questions. Thanks.
Toby, can you pass the mic to Kathy in front of you? That's it. Okay.
It's on already, Kathy.
May I make a couple of comments as well as a question, or two or three in one? I'm an ex-primary teacher, and I'm a bit disappointed. I thought your talk was really good, and I've been to one of your training courses, it was excellent. And I do think resources on your website have improved immensely in the last 2 or 3 years. But you chose both your examples for either secondary students or right at the other end of a primary age. And I think personally it's vitally important that very young children are taught there may not be a God, that it's an option. And I think that's important to be stressed. And perhaps some of your resources for very young children to be made more interactive. But I've also got to ask a question. I'm not quite sure what the case is. I know the Commission on RA did suggest that they stopped having the lawful assembly qualification, which most schools were supposed to have a broadly Christian assembly every day. And the Commission on RA suggested they stopped doing that and they had an assembly. It was sort of people getting together. I just wondered what the legal thing was on that now.
Sure. So first on your comment, we're continually sort of developing new resources, and we absolutely encourage people to get in touch, particularly teachers, and say where there are gaps. And I do think there
Can
are.
I just say I have done?
Okay. And yeah, I do think sometimes a lot of our resources are focused more in the middle ground, and there's definitely more room for resources both at sort of early years, Key Stage 1, and at Key Stage 5 as well. In terms of the collective worship question, so the Commission on RE was focused on RE, so on the subject of RE, so it didn't look at questions around collective worship. Collective worship is something
Sorry, I
separate.
thought they did recommend. I read an article on it, and in that it said they recommended it. No, I'm absolutely
It may have been connected to something different, because their brief was to focus purely on religious education.
Okay, I will look at.
Yeah.
I stand to be corrected, but I think it's worth. I'd like to know what the official. Well, obviously.
Well, in terms of what the legal position is, so basically,
it's Christian, isn't it? Still.
so currently schools have to have daily acts of collective worship, and I think I can't remember the exact phrasing, but the majority of these need to be of a Christian, broadly Christian nature. Now, of course, that leaves open a lot of options. A majority could be 51%. You could say just doing, let's do an assembly on kindness without mentioning Christianity at all, and you could say, well, that's of a broadly Christian nature because Christians think we should be kind. And so you could get away, so schools can get away with doing largely what they like. The issue is, of course, that even though some schools will say, okay, we have to do collective worship, but we're not really going to do it, we're going to fudge it a bit, because some schools do take that to heart and therefore do include prayers and have a much more overt act of worship in their assembly time. Obviously, again, that's something Humanists UK campaign that should be changed. But very often they're sort of separate issues. That the religious education question is a slightly separate one from the act of collective worship.
Would you like to pass the mic to Angela, and then we will get to you, John. We're just doing that little brave
I'm thinking about my own childhood, and that a lot of the ideas I picked up, okay, a whole lot from school, but also from reading fiction. And I'm wondering, and Kat has brought up the idea that most of the materials you've produced so far are geared at middle or secondary children, and I'm wondering if you have ideas of producing fiction, hard copy, storybooks, even for younger children, that will just gently introduce ideas that aren't always Jesus-centered.
No, I think it's a very valid point. I think stories are very often the best way to sort of explore the big questions. I think obviously we have a limited capacity in terms of the number of resources we can produce. We will recommend books written by other people that can introduce sort of big questions from a sort of non-religious perspective. I mean, I suppose the thing with sometimes people say to you, where are your humanist stories? Christians have their stories and different religions have their stories. Where are your humanist stories? And the answer to that is often, well, they're all humanist stories. They're all stories about how we should live. You can read the story of the Good Samaritan and not see it as a religious story at all. You can all the stories from religions, you can often remove the supernatural elements and get something from them. in terms of stories that are explicitly humanist, it's quite difficult to then, that would require, at the moment there are very few. I understand somebody, I can't remember, someone in the room is writing one at the moment, but I think what I think we need to be able to do is to be able to give teachers and students the opportunity to see within stories what that already exists as well, where those messages come out. But if people are writing new stories that they think can help get across those messages, perhaps more explicitly, then again, do let us know. Yeah, let us know about them.
The one I use is Darwin, because that's a great story, of the beagle and the scientific exploration, etc. So.
It is. Have a look on our website, on the Understanding Humanism website. We have a list of recommended books, and it includes the whole load of picture books. And again, none of them mention humanism. Very few of them, I suppose, mention anything really connected with religion and that sort of and those questions. But they're full of ideas about what's the best way to live, how can we find meaning in our lives, how should we treat other people, how can we be happy, all of these sorts of questions. And so we do recommend a whole range of different picture books, which we think certainly non-religious parents can use with their students to explore some of those big questions. And there are also some recommendations on there for books connected with things like evolution or the Big Bang, and so kind of scientific understanding of reality, but done from a picture book sort of level for either preschoolers or students, younger students.
Would you agree that one of our disadvantages is that whenever something comes up, you mentioned kindness a little while ago, that is then labelled as a Christian virtue. It gets appropriated.
It is, and I think one of the big things we want to focus on is Christian values very often are human values. These are just values that the reason they're values is because human beings have lived together as social animals for a long, long time and concluded that very often this is the best way to survive, but also to thrive as a community. It's always frustrating when you go into a C of E school and see Christian values and you look down the list and think, they're all human values. It's something that we work on.
John.
Ladybird Nook coming up. Must be a vacancy writing herself. Question. That graph you showed me, when you said non-religious now 53%, there was one religious group which was going up dramatically, if I read the colour correctly, it said other Christians.
Yeah.
Who are they, and are they represented in your discussion?
Who are the other Christians? Okay, so in a bit more detail, the top line, I realise I kind of talked about some of the data, but I didn't actually really describe the graph, you're right. So the top line, the red line, is the non-religious. The line that almost mirrors it, going in the opposite direction, is the Church of England.
Sure that's not the Tories and the Labour Party.
I thought we were going to avoid politics. And what's interesting about before I come on to your question, what's interesting about that is this because actually significantly more people are becoming non-religious, or is this just becoming the default answer? So whereas back in 1980, if somebody said to you, tick a box, if you were non-religious, you thought, oh well, I'm English, I guess I tick the C of E box because that's just the default box to tick. Whereas now, if you're not religious, the default box is no religion. So it's become much easier for people to kind of just be non-religious in that sense. So either we're seeing a significant shift, or actually this perhaps goes back longer. But either way, obviously we're seeing that a lot more people are non-religious. The lines below that, the fairly static green line is Catholics. So they're remaining fairly steady, although that's quite often partly due to immigration, a lot of immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe, which is keeping that line afloat. The increasing line is other Christian, it's basically non-denominational Christians. So it comes from the kind of evangelical groups, a lot of new churches, particularly in London. There's a huge number of new churches opening up as well. And what's actually happened in the later survey is that's actually overtaken Church of England now. So the church, although that group is obviously a diverse group, but the Christian, it's not saying that they're the largest Christian group, but now, yeah, the number of people who define themselves as Christian but not the Church of England, even ignoring the Catholics, is now greater.
Are they represented on this commission in some way?
So the commission reached out to a huge number of people. So it reached out to educators, to representatives of faith and belief groups, to try and get their input about what they felt our reach should be. And I think, I would, and on the Sacre I was on, there are a number of representatives of the Church of England, but then there are representatives of other different Christian churches as well. And I think, they, like us, think that if we're going to represent Christianity, if we're going to talk about Christianity, you have to show that there's diversity within any belief.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, so I'm just going to take two more questions, one from David and then one from Ron, and then we've got the talkback session later anyway. So David first.
Thank you, David. I didn't realise it would be so quick there. Just a couple of the Havari quotes. They were awful, weren't they? I mean, I've got to be honest. Is he not confusing just humans for humanism? He was describing pretty much what humans are rather than humanism in particular. I'm a very big atheist, but I do agree with there being some religious education in school. I have to say, I think the name's awful. I think calling it worldview would be better. And my question is, I appreciate you were saying that religious education is generally done quite well, but when does it become indoctrination? And you were saying that the Church of England is bringing massive packs of information, and generally that's all that schools get, and that's therefore what they present, and particularly in faith schools. So is that then turning into indoctrination?
It's a sort of $1 million question, really. It's how you define when learning about religions, when learning about answers to these big questions, becomes an attempt to persuade people that these are the correct answers. And I think it's one of those things that, at the extremes, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious. Sometimes when we see indoctrination, sometimes you say, we can see what's going on there, this is clearly unacceptable. And you can also have extremely good RE teaching in which you can see a whole range of views being tested and all of them picked apart, and that's the kind of that's what we really want to see. But then there's this, I suppose, great grey area in which something like understanding Christianity falls into, which is even though it says it's an attempt to teach young people about Christianity, the sheer volume of stuff that's there, the fact that it can dominate a school curriculum, means that young people aren't getting the chance to encounter a range of views. I mean, there are plenty of Christians who object to understanding Christianity as well, because it's very much presented as a Church of England Christianity. It's very much a Christians believe. And if you look at some of the questions within there, things like, how do Christians come to terms with the dilemma relating to the Trinity, that God is one thing and three things, or I can't remember the wording of the question obviously, but the simple answer to that is, well, most Christians don't. Most Christians never think about that, they never consider it, but it's very much presented as these are the things that Christians are dealing with all the time. All Christians are theologians, and I think that's where it becomes difficult, because it's I think it sort of implies that to be one of these people, you have to take on all of this, and you have to see it this particular way. But yeah, going back to your question, I think it's difficult to come up with a definition. I think you sort of know it when you see it. And I think sometimes people don't always know that they're doing it as well. I think I can read RE Today magazine and I can see some of the resources that they have in there, and sometimes some of the people who write those resources, I know them and I think, yeah, you're probably not trying to indoctrinate people, but the language used in this resource is doing that implicitly, if not explicitly, because it is asking, what is purely referring to religion rather than asking about what a non-religious perspective might be on this question. And so very often, I think people need. I think there's a lot of education. There's a lot of goodwill from RE teachers out there, but sometimes they don't know that they're doing this when they're doing it as well. So sort of roundabout way of saying, I don't really have a good definition, but yeah, I think you know it when you see it.
Okay, Ron.
Thank you for your presentation. By what criteria do you distinguish the non-religious from the religious? In other words, how do we make the difference between the religious people and the non-religious?
Well, again, it's a difficult question. I think there's, because there's, within those categories, there is such diversity. So there will be people who will tick the religious box, but be atheist. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think it's about 40% of people who will describe themselves as Jewish will also describe themselves as atheist. The numbers are slightly lower for Christians, significantly lower for Muslims, but still, there's still a reasonable number of them who say I'm a Muslim, but I'm an atheist. And within that non-religious group, there will be plenty of people who say I'm not religious, but I believe in God, or I'm not religious, but I believe in an afterlife. And so, picking apart these beliefs can become is extremely difficult. The sort of saying you're religious or non-religious doesn't really tell you a lot. It gives you something to work on, but I think the key thing is looking at the trend. So if that trend of non-religious is going up, I think that does indicate that probably more people are moving towards a more humanist outlook on life overall. But it certainly doesn't tell you that actually those non-religious people are all have a sort of humanist understanding. I think when it comes to defining the word religion, there are all sorts of. I mean, there are plenty of people who would take a kind of functional definition of religion and say that humanism is a religion, because a religion is simply something that is a worldview, is an approach to life in the sense that humanism is. And there are those who will adopt a more essentialist definition of religion, which is something that requires a belief in something supernatural or something transcendental, and without that, it's not a religion. So there's no clear-cut answer, and within the categories themselves, there's a lot of diversity as well.
Thank you.
Luke, thank you so much for a really informative and engaging afternoon. We're going to present you with a well-deserved